The Galactic Council Chamber was the largest room ever built by any species in known space. It floated at the heart of Aminar Prime, a station so old that no one remembered who built it first. The chamber was shaped like a deep bowl, with 12 elevated platforms arranged in a circle, each one reserved for a species that had earned its place among the stars. The ceiling was open to the void, covered only by a thin shield of energy that let the cold light of a dead star pour in from above. It was meant to remind every delegate of how small they were against the universe. But most of them had forgotten that lesson a long time ago. On this day, all 12 seats were filled. The Veshan delegation sat at the highest platform, as they always did. Their Grand Arbiter, Tolmec, was nearly 400 years old, with skin like cracked stone and eyes that glowed a dull orange. He had led the council for over a century. He spoke slowly, not because he was weak, but because he believed every word he said carried the weight of law. And for most of the galaxy, it did. Beside the Veshan sat the Karathi Collective, led by Delegate Fail. The Karathi were thin, tall, and pale, with faces that never showed emotion, unless they wanted them to. Fail was the worst of them. He smiled when he lied and frowned when he told the truth, and no one could ever tell which was which. He had spent the last 20 years making sure that humanity got the worst of every deal, the last seat at every table, and the smallest share of every resource. And then, at the very bottom of the chamber, on the lowest platform, sat humanity. Ambassador Han Do-yun walked in exactly on time, not early, not late. He wore a simple dark suit with no medals, no symbols, and no flags. Behind him came 3 people. Vice Admiral Yun Nari, tall and straight-backed, with a face that could have been carved from ice. Quan Ji Huan, the intelligence analyst, carried a single thin device in his hand and nothing else. And Shin Yuna, the linguistics expert, moved quietly to the far end of the human platform and sat with her hands folded, watching everything. Do-hyun took his seat without greeting anyone. He did not smile. He did not wave. He simply sat down and looked straight ahead, waiting. The Council had called this session to renegotiate Earth's resource-sharing agreements. These were the same agreements that had been renegotiated every 5 years for the past 4 decades, and every time the terms got worse for humanity. More restrictions, fewer systems, higher tariffs. It was not negotiation. It was a ritual of slow strangulation, dressed up in polite language and official seals. Tolmec opened the session with the usual formalities. His voice filled the chamber like distant thunder. He welcomed the delegates, reminded them of the rules, and then turned the floor over to Fail, who had requested the first speaking slot. Fail stood slowly, letting the silence stretch. He looked down at the human platform, with the kind of expression a person might give to a stain on their floor. The Karathi Collective proposes an amendment to the current expansion terms, he began. In light of recent ecological surveys, we recommend restricting human settlement in 3 contested systems, Rovelen, Outer Tanis, and the Dwin Corridor. These regions contain sensitive biological formations that must be preserved. It was a lie. Everyone in the room knew it was a lie. The ecological surveys had been funded by the Karathi themselves, and the so-called sensitive formations were barren rocks that happened to sit on top of rich mineral deposits. But no one challenged it. No one ever did. The other species either benefited from keeping humanity small, or they were too afraid of the Karathi to speak up. One by one, the other delegates gave their statements. The Veshan supported the restrictions. The Oreni abstained, as they always did. The Molvari and the Tasik echoed Fail's concerns with carefully rehearsed words. The minor species, the Pelun, the Draith, the Havi, said nothing at all. They sat in their seats and stared at the floor, because they knew that what was being done to humanity today had been done to them long before. Through all of this, Do-hyun did not move. He did not whisper to his team. He did not tap his fingers or shift in his seat. He simply listened. Yuna, beside him, watched the alien delegates with sharp eyes. She could read the tiny movements of Karathi facial muscles. The way Tolmec's fingers twitched when he was bored. The slight lean of the Pelin delegate's body toward the human platform. A lean that said without words, "I am sorry." When the last delegate finished speaking, Tolmec turned his ancient gaze down to the lowest platform. "The floor is now open to the human delegation," he said. His tone suggested he expected this to take no more than a few minutes. Do-hyun stood. He buttoned his jacket with one hand. He looked around the chamber slowly, meeting every pair of eyes, every lens, every sensory organ that passed for sight among the species gathered here. He took his time. He was in no hurry. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. 20. Fail shifted in his seat. Tolmec's fingers twitched again. Then Do-hyun spoke. His voice was calm, clear, and carried no emotion at all. "We have prepared a counter-proposal," he said. "But first, with the Council's permission, I would like to ask a single question." Tolmec frowned. This was unusual. Delegates made statements. They did not ask questions. "You may proceed," Tolmec said, because refusing would look petty, and the Veshan were never petty in public. Do-hyun nodded once. "My question is simple," he said. "In 40 years of sitting at this table, Earth has made 1,216 formal requests. Requests for fair trade, requests for equal representation, requests for the enforcement of treaties that this council itself wrote and signed." He paused. How many of those requests were granted? No one answered. The chamber was silent. Do-hyun let the silence hold for 3 long seconds. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and placed it on the podium. "0, he said quietly. "The answer is 0. He looked up at the Grand Arbiter. "Let me tell you why that number matters." The chamber did not like silence. It was built for voices, for declarations, for the booming authority of species who believed they owned the stars. Silence made it feel empty, and right now, with Han Do-hyun standing at the lowest podium, holding a single sheet of paper, the silence was so heavy that even the hum of the station's engines seemed to fade. Do-hyun placed his hands flat on the podium. He was not nervous. He had been preparing for this day for over 20 years, long before anyone gave him the title of ambassador. He had been preparing since the day he stood in this same chamber as a junior attaché, 23 years old, watching Earth's first real ambassador beg. Her name was Go Mirei. She had been a kind woman, brilliant, patient, full of hope that the galaxy could be reasoned with. Do-hyun remembered how she had stood at this same podium and asked, in a voice that trembled only slightly, for the Council to honor the trade agreement it had signed just 3 years earlier. The agreement promised Earth access to the fuel refineries in the Tanis Belt. Without that fuel, 2 human colonies would run dry within a year. Fail's predecessor had laughed. Not quietly, not behind a hand. He had laughed openly, and half the chamber had laughed with him. Tolmec had watched with those old burning eyes and said nothing. Go Mirei had flown home that night. She resigned the next morning. She never spoke about the council again. She died 4 years later, and the official records said it was illness. But Do-hyun knew better. Some things break a person in ways that medicine cannot fix. He never forgot that laugh. He carried it with him like a stone in his chest, and he let it sit there for 20 years until it became something harder than anger. It became patience. Now he looked up at the chamber and began. 40 years ago, he said, Earth was invited to join this council. We were told it was an honor. We were told that membership meant protection, fair trade, and a voice in galactic affairs. We believed it. We signed every document. We followed every rule. We sent our best people to sit in this chair and speak to you with respect." He tapped the sheet of paper on the podium. "This is a summary. In 40 years, Earth has filed 1,216 formal requests through proper council channels. Trade adjustments, border disputes, resource appeals, treaty enforcement. Every single one was filed correctly, on time, in the proper format, in every required language." He looked at Fail. 0 were approved, not 1. Fail's expression did not change, but Yuna, watching from the side, saw the faintest tightening of his jaw. He had not expected this. Do-hyun continued. In the same period, the Kirathi Collective filed 608 requests. 591 were approved. The Veshan Dominion filed 412. All 412 were approved. He let those numbers sit in the air. We were not denied because our requests were unreasonable. We were denied because it was convenient, because keeping humanity small kept everyone else comfortable. Kwon Jawan stood and activated the thin device in his hand. A holographic display bloomed above the human platform, filling the lower half of the chamber with light. Numbers, dates, documents, and signatures floated in the air, slowly rotating so that every delegate could see. "These are the records," Do-hyun said. "Every treaty that was signed and then broken. Every tariff that was raised without notice. Every system that was promised to us and then quietly reassigned." The display showed a timeline. In the first 5 years of Earth's membership, 3 trade agreements had been violated. In the next 5, 7 more. By year 20, the violations had become so routine that the Council did not even bother hiding them. One document showed a Kirathi internal memo that casually referred to Earth's trade allocation as the scraps budget. A low murmur spread through the chamber. The minor species, the Pelun and the Draith and the Havi, were staring at the display with wide eyes, not because they were surprised by what it showed, but because no one had ever dared to show it. Fail rose from his seat. "This is theater," he said sharply. "The Council does not have time for—" "Sit down," Do-hyun said. The words were not loud, they were not angry, but they cut through the chamber like a blade per still water. Fail froze. In 1,200 years of Council history, no human had ever told a Kirathi delegate to sit down. Do-hyun looked at him with steady, unblinking eyes. "You will have your turn," he said, "as we had ours, waiting for 40 years. Fail looked to Tolmec for support. The Grand Arbiter said nothing. After a moment, Fail sat. His pale face was tight with something that might have been anger, or might have been the first faint stirring of fear. Do-hyun turned back to the chamber. "I am not here to complain," he said. "Complaining is what you expected us to do. It is what every species does when they come to this podium with their grievances. They complain, and then they accept whatever the Council gives them, because they believe they have no other choice." He paused and looked at the minor species. The Pelun delegate met his eyes. The Havi delegate, small and gray-skinned, was gripping the edge of her seat. "Earth came to this Council with open hands," Do-hyun said. "We asked for nothing that was not already promised to us. We followed your rules. We respected your systems. We waited, and we waited, and we waited. And every year, you took a little more and you gave a little less, and you told us to be grateful." He folded the sheet of paper and slipped it back into his jacket. "So we stopped waiting." The chamber went quiet again. Tolmec leaned forward, his stone-like face cracking with the faintest expression of concern. "What do you mean, Ambassador?" the Grand Arbiter asked. Do-hyun looked up at him. For the first time, something moved behind his calm expression. Not anger, not sadness, something older and deeper. Something that had been building for 40 years, buried under silence and patience, and the memory of a kind woman who had been laughed out of this room. I mean, Do-hyun said slowly, that while you were busy ignoring us, we were busy preparing. And now I would like to show you what 40 years of silence looks like when it finally decides to speak. He nodded to Vice Admiral Yoon Nari, who had been standing still as a statue behind him this entire time. She stepped forward, and the holographic display shifted, and the chamber held its breath. Vice Admiral Yoon Nari had not spoken a single word since entering the chamber. She had not needed to. Her presence alone had done enough. She was tall for a human, with short dark hair and a face that seemed permanently set in an expression that said she had already considered every possible outcome of this moment, and was not worried about any of them. She stepped to the front of the platform and raised one hand. The holographic display above them changed. The documents and treaty records vanished. In their place, a three-dimensional map of the galaxy bloomed into existence, so detailed and so bright that several delegates shielded their eyes. Blue dots marked human space, the small, cramped cluster of systems that the Council had assigned to Earth decades ago. It looked tiny, pathetic even, a handful of stars in a galaxy of billions. Then Nari pressed a button, and the map changed. New markers appeared, not blue, but gold. They spread across the map like a slow wave, reaching into regions that the Council had never monitored. Deep space zones that were considered empty, dark pockets between major trade lanes where no one ever looked because there was nothing worth seeing. Except there was. These, Do-hyun said calmly, are Earth's deep space construction yards, 37 of them, built over the last 19 years in locations outside Council sensor range. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Tomek's glowing eyes widened. Fail gripped the edge of his platform. You will notice, Do-hyun continued, that none of these facilities are within Council-regulated space. We broke no laws. We violated no treaties. We simply built where you were not looking, because you never thought to look. Nari expanded the display. Each gold marker opened into a detailed schematic showing what had been built there. Shipyards, fuel refineries, weapons research stations, training academies, supply depots, stocked with enough provisions to sustain a full military campaign for years. Earth's active fleet, Nari said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was low and steady. As of this morning, consists of 412 combat-ready vessels. This is 3 times the number listed in our official Council filings. She let that sink in. The discrepancy is not an error, she added. It is by design. Do-hyun watched the chamber carefully. He could see the calculations happening behind every alien face. 412 ships was not the largest fleet in the galaxy. The Veshan had more. The Karathi had about the same. But no one had expected humans to have even half that number. Every intelligence report, every spy network, every estimate had put Earth's fleet at 140 ships at most. They had been wrong by a factor of 3. And in galactic politics, being wrong by that much meant that everything else you believed about that species was probably wrong too. How, Tomek said slowly, did you build this without our knowledge? Do-hyun tilted his head slightly. You never asked, he said. In 40 years, the Council conducted 0 inspections of human deep space territories, 0 audits of our industrial output, 0 intelligence reviews. You assumed we were too small to matter. He paused. That assumption was a gift, and we used every moment of it. Nari changed the display again. This time it showed technical schematics, engine designs, shield configurations, weapon systems, side by side with their alien equivalents. 22 years ago, Do-hyun said, the Council approved a technology sharing program. Earth received Level 2 clearance, which gave us access to basic propulsion designs and outdated shield technology. Level 2 is what you give to species you consider children. A few delegates shifted uncomfortably. Level 2 was indeed the lowest tier. It was an insult, wrapped in generosity. We accepted it graciously, Do-hyun said, and then we took everything you gave us and made it better. The schematics on display told the story. Earth's engineers had taken the basic Kirathi engine design and redesigned it from the ground up. The result was 15% faster and used 30% less fuel. They had taken the Veshan shield templates and combined them with human materials science to create a hybrid system that was, according to the data on screen, more resilient than anything the Veshan themselves currently used. Tolmec stared at the shield data. His stone face showed nothing, but his fingers had stopped moving entirely. For a being as old as him, stillness was the loudest possible alarm. But ships and shields are only part of what we built, Do-hyun said. He looked at the minor species delegates. The most important thing we built was trust. The display changed one final time. It showed a network of lines connecting Earth to 4 other species, the Pelan, the Draith, the Havi, and the Omek. Lines of trade, mutual defense, and shared intelligence. A web of alliances that had been growing quietly for over a decade. The Pelan delegate, a small being with dark, wet eyes, straightened in his seat. The Havi delegate lifted her chin. The Draith representative, who had not moved the entire session, placed both of his broad hands flat on the table in front of him, a gesture that in Draith culture meant, "I stand with these people." These 4 species were being exploited the same way we were, Do-hyun said. Worse, in some cases. The Pelan lost 3 colony worlds to Kirathi rezoning. The Havi have been paying fuel tariffs 4 times the standard rate for 30 years. The Draith were denied voting rights on resource allocation, despite being founding members of this council. Fail stood again. His composure was cracking. "This is conspiracy," he said, his voice sharp. "Secret alliances within the council are a direct violation of—" "Of what?" Do-hyun interrupted. "Show me the law. Point to the clause. You wrote every rule in this council to benefit yourselves. You never imagined someone else would learn to do the same." Fail opened his mouth and closed it. "You call it conspiracy," Do-hyun said, looking at him with a calm that was somehow more frightening than any display of anger. "We call it learning from your example." Fail sat down slowly, and this time he did not look at Tolmec for help. He looked at the minor species, and for the first time, he saw something in their eyes that he had never seen before. Not fear, not submission, solidarity. The chamber fell silent. "Ambassador Han," the Grand Arbiter said, and his voice carried the careful weight of someone who was beginning to understand that the ground beneath him had shifted. "You have shown us your ships, your alliances, your technology. You have made your point clearly." He leaned forward. "Now tell us what you want." Do-hyun looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time in the entire session, he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a cruel smile. It was the smile of a man who had been carrying a weight for decades and was finally, at last, about to set it down. "Grand Arbiter," he said softly, "we do not want anything from this council. Not anymore." The smile faded, and that is exactly what should worry you. For 3 seconds, nobody in the Galactic Council chamber moved. The words hung in the recycled air like smoke after an explosion. And every being in the room processed them at a different speed, but arrived at the same conclusion at the same time. The humans did not come here to negotiate. Then the chamber broke open. The Kirathi delegation erupted first. Fail was on his feet before the echo of Do-hyun's voice had faded. His pale face flushed with a color that Yuna recognized as the Kirathi equivalent of panic, dressed up as outrage. 2 of his aides were talking over each other in rapid Kirathi, their thin fingers stabbing at data screens. The Malvari delegate slammed a broad fist against his platform and demanded clarification in a voice like grinding metal. The Tasik began speaking all at once, which was how their species expressed collective distress, and the sound filled the chamber like a broken instrument playing every note at once. Tolmec raised both hands. "Order," he said. The word rolled through the chamber with the force of a man who had silenced rooms for 100 years. The noise dropped, but it did not die. It simmered beneath the surface, waiting. Do-hyun stood perfectly still through all of it. His hands were at his sides. His expression had returned to its natural state of calm. Behind him, Nari stood like a wall. Jiwon watched his data feeds with quiet focus, and Yuna continued to read the room, cataloging every twitch and breath. Tolmec fixed his ancient gaze on the human ambassador. "Explain yourself," he said, clearly. Do-hyun nodded. "Earth is formally withdrawing from all existing treaties with the Galactic Council," he said. "Every trade agreement, every resource-sharing compact, every territorial assignment, and every obligation we were given as a condition of membership. All of it. Effective immediately." The words were simple. The meaning was a ripple effect. "Furthermore," Do-hyun continued, "Earth and its coalition partners, the Pelin Republic, the Draith Federation, the Havi Collective, and the Olmec provinces, will establish an independent trade and security network operating outside Council jurisdiction. We will govern our own borders, set our own tariffs, and manage our own affairs." He looked around the chamber one more time. "The Council's authority over human space is over." Fail stepped forward to the edge of his platform. His composure was gone now, replaced by something raw and sharp. "You cannot do this," he said. "Withdrawal from Council treaties requires a unanimous vote of all member species. You know this. Which is why we are not requesting withdrawal. We are declaring it." The distinction hit the room like a slap. Requesting meant asking permission. Declaring meant they had already decided, and they were simply informing the Council as a courtesy. It was the difference between a child asking to leave the table and an adult standing up and walking out the door. Fail's voice went cold. "And if the Council does not accept your declaration?" Do-hyun said nothing. He simply looked at Nari. The Vice Admiral stepped forward and changed the holographic display one last time. The galaxy map returned, but now it showed something new. Red markers, hundreds of them, positioned along every border between human space and Council territory. Each marker represented a ship. Earth's hidden fleet, the 412 vessels that nobody had known about until 20 minutes ago, was already deployed. Not advancing, not threatening, just there, present, watching, waiting. "These ships moved into position 6 hours ago," Nari said. "They have been instructed not to fire unless fired upon. They will hold their positions indefinitely." The message was clear. Earth was not starting a war, but if the Council wanted one, Earth was ready to finish it. Fail stared at the display. His mouth opened and closed twice without producing sound. Then he turned to Tolmec with something in his eyes that Yuna had never seen in a Karathi before. Desperation. "Grand Arbiter," Fail said, "this is an act of aggression. The Council must respond." Tolmec did not answer immediately. He was old, and old beings do not rush toward decisions that might end civilizations. He looked at the fleet positions on the display. He looked at the minor species delegates, 3 of whom had just been revealed as Earth's allies. He looked at Do-hyun, standing calmly at the lowest platform in the chamber. And he understood something that Fail had not yet grasped. The humans were not bluffing. They had never bluffed. Every word they had said today was backed by years of preparation, and every ship on that display was exactly where it was supposed to be. This was not a desperate move by a cornered species. This was a plan that had been set in motion decades ago, executed with the kind of patience that the Veshan had always believed only they possessed. Tolmec chose his words carefully. "Ambassador Han," he said, and his voice was softer now, stripped of its usual authority. "Every species in this galaxy has learned over time that survival requires compromise. Surely humanity can find a way to... No. The word came from Do-yoon like a door closing. Not shouted, not whispered, just spoken, with a finality that left no room for anything after it. No, he said again. We cannot. He stepped out from behind the podium and stood at the very edge of the human platform. Below him was the empty floor of the chamber. Above him, arranged in their elevated seats, were the 12 species that had ruled this galaxy for centuries. He looked up at them, and for a moment, the geometry of the room said everything. One man standing at the bottom, looking up at power. Then he spoke. You taught us that compromise was surrender wrapped in polite language. For 40 years we compromised. We gave ground. We lowered our voices. We followed every rule you wrote, and you changed the rules every time we started to succeed. You told us to be patient, and then you punished us for our patience. You offered us a seat at this table, and then made sure the chair was always broken. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. So here is our answer, without the politeness. The chamber was so silent that the faint crackle of the energy shield above could be heard, the sound of a dead star pressing against the only thing keeping the void at bay. Do-hyun spoke the words that would be remembered for centuries. We will never kneel at a table we were forced to build. Today, we leave it. Tomorrow, we set our own. Nobody breathed. The words did not echo. The chamber was designed to absorb sound after a speaker finished, so that each voice existed only in its moment. But these words did not need an echo. They carved themselves into the silence and stayed there, heavy and permanent, like something written in stone. Observer Drayan, the neutral faction historian who had been recording every council session for the past 200 years, sat in his small booth at the edge of the chamber. His recording light blinked steadily, as it always did, but his hand, which usually rested calmly on his console, was pressed flat against the surface, fingers white with pressure. In 2 centuries of documentation, he had never recorded a moment like this. He knew, with the certainty of a historian who had studied the rise and fall of empires, that the galaxy had just changed. Do-hyun straightened his jacket. He gave a slight bow to the chamber. Not deep, not respectful, just a small nod of the head that said this is over, and turned his back on the Galactic Council. Nari fell into step behind him, then Ji-hwan, then Yuna, who paused for just a moment at the edge of the platform, and looked back at the Pelun delegate. The small being with the dark, wet eyes gave her the tiniest nod. The human delegation walked out of the chamber in silence. The door closed behind them with a soft sound that somehow carried more weight than any explosion. And in the great bowl of the Galactic Council chamber, beneath the light of a dead star, 12 species sat in their elevated seats and said nothing at all. The first hour after the human delegation left the chamber was chaos. Not the organized kind, where leaders raise their voices and then find a path forward. This was the other kind. The kind where everyone talks and nobody listens. Where alliances crack in real time and old enemies suddenly realize they might need each other. Fail was the loudest. He demanded an emergency military session. He called for sanctions, blockades, and the immediate seizure of human assets in council space. He pointed at the empty human platform as if it had personally offended him, and declared that Earth's actions constituted an act of war. But nobody seconded his motion. The Malvari delegate, who had always voted alongside the Kirathi, sat quietly and said nothing. The Tasik, who relied on Kirathi trade routes, looked at the fleet positions still glowing on the holographic display, and calculated the cost of a war they had not prepared for. Even the Oreni, who had abstained from every meaningful vote in living memory, seemed to lean away from Fail as he spoke. And then, 20 minutes after the humans walked out, the Pelin delegate stood. The Pelin Republic, he said in his quiet, careful voice, is suspending its participation in all council trade agreements, pending a full review of treaty compliance. He paused, and his dark eyes swept the chamber. We will be joining the new coalition's trade network, effective immediately. Before the murmur could settle, the HFY delegate rose. The HFY collective echoes this position, she said. Her gray skin was flushed with something that looked like relief, as though she had been waiting years to say these words. We have endured enough. The Draith representative placed both hands flat on his table again, that same gesture of solidarity, and said simply, the Draith Federation stands with Earth. 3 species, gone, not conquered, not threatened, not bribed. They left because someone had finally shown them the door and told them it was open. Tolmec sat in his elevated chair and watched his council fracture. He said nothing. He was 400 years old, and he had seen empires rise and crumble, but he had never seen it happen in a single afternoon. He had always believed the council was permanent, as fixed as the dead star that lit this station. He was beginning to understand that he had been wrong. File, alone now in his outrage, looked around the chamber for allies, and found empty stares looking back at him. His mouth closed, he sat down, and for the first time in his long career of manipulation and control, Delegate File of the Karathi Collective had absolutely nothing to say. Across the galaxy, the broadcast spread. Earth's diplomatic channels released the full unedited recording of the council session within hours. It was not edited for drama. It did not need to be. The raw footage, from Do-hyun's first question to his final bow, was enough. It moved through communication networks at the speed of light, passed from station to station, ship to ship, world to world. On Earth, billions watched. Families gathered around screens in small apartments and large halls alike. In the city of Busan, where Do-hyun had grown up, an old woman who ran a noodle shop near the harbor saw the broadcast playing on a screen across the street and stopped stirring her pot. She watched the whole thing standing in her doorway, and when Do-hyun spoke the final line, she wiped her eyes with her apron and went back to work. She did not know the ambassador personally, but she understood him. She understood the kind of silence that builds over a lifetime, and the relief of finally breaking it. The line became everything. It was printed on walls and projected onto buildings. Ship crews painted it on their hulls in white letters a meter tall. Students wrote it on their bags. Teachers read it to their classrooms. It was not a war cry. It was something quieter and more lasting. It was a promise. Vice Admiral Yoon Nari spent the following week overseeing the repositioning of Earth's fleet. There was no battle, no confrontation. The council ships that patrolled the contested borders received new orders to withdraw to a safe distance, and they followed those orders without argument. The crews on both sides watched each other through their view screens, and some of them exchanged quiet signals of acknowledgement. Not friendship, not hostility, just the recognition that something had changed, and fighting about it would be pointless. The new coalition's trade routes opened within a month. Ships that had once been forced to pay Karathi tariffs now moved freely through corridors that Earth's engineers had mapped in secret years ago. The Pelin, who had nearly lost their economy to unfair pricing, saw their fuel costs drop by 60% overnight. The HFY began exporting their medical technologies directly to Earth, creating a partnership that would save millions of lives on both sides within the first year. Kwon Ji-hwan, the intelligence analyst who had stood silently in the chamber holding his thin device, published a report that became required reading at every military academy on Earth. It was a detailed account of how Earth had built its shadow infrastructure over 19 years without detection. The report was dry, technical, and full of logistics tables, but its conclusion was quoted almost as often as Do-hyun's line. It read, in simple language that Ji-hwan preferred, "They did not see us, because they did not believe we were worth seeing. That was their only mistake, and it was enough. Shin Yuna returned to her academic work with a new project. She had been tracking something interesting in the weeks after the broadcast. A linguistic shift across the galaxy. 14 alien languages had adopted a new word, borrowed from Korean and adapted into their own grammar. The word was doksol, which roughly meant a harsh truth spoken without flinching. The Pelin used it as a verb. The Draeth used it as a title of respect. The Molvari, who had quietly begun distancing themselves from the Karathi, used it as an insult, directed at Fail, who had failed to see the truth even when it was spoken directly to his face. Observer Drayan released his full recording to every species in the galaxy. He attached a personal note, which was unusual for someone whose job required strict neutrality. The note read, "In 2,000 years of council records, no species has ever left the table. The humans did not merely leave. They showed the galaxy that the table was never fair to begin with. I am a historian, and it is not my place to judge. But I will say this. I have been waiting a very long time for someone to do what they did." The Galactic Council did not dissolve, but it shrank. Over the following months, 2 more species quietly withdrew. The remaining members held emergency sessions that produced no results. Fail was recalled by his government and replaced by a younger delegate who used the word cooperation in her first address without any trace of irony. Tolmec remained. He sat in his chair, high above the half-empty chamber, and did what old beings do when the world they built begins to crumble around them. He thought. He remembered. And late one night, alone in the chamber with only the dead star for company, he replayed Do-hyun's final words on his personal console. He listened to them 3 times. Then, he turned off the console and sat in the dark for a very long time. 1 year later, a new table was built. It was not on Aminar Prime. It was on a small station that Earth and its partners had constructed together, orbiting a young blue star in neutral space. The station was modest. The chamber was simple. The seats were all at the same level, because that had been the first rule agreed upon by every member. Han Do-hyun sat in one of those seats. He was quieter now than he had been a year ago. He did not give speeches. He did not make demands. He listened to the Pelon trade minister discuss shipping routes, and he nodded when the Javi delegate proposed a joint medical research program, and he signed documents with the same calm expression he had worn in the council chamber, the one that gave nothing away. Yuna sat beside him, as she always did, watching the faces around the table. But there was something different in the room now. The faces were not afraid. The voices were not careful. For the first time in her career, she was in a room where every species at the table believed they belonged there. After the session ended, Do-hyun stood by a wide window that looked out at the blue star. Nari walked up beside him and stood in her usual silence. After a while, she said, "They are already calling it the Do-hyun Doctrine. Did you know?" He shook his head. "I did not do anything that required a name." "You walked out of a room," she said, and the galaxy followed. He looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped. Not much, just enough to show something underneath that was not strength or anger or patience, but simple, quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally putting it down. "I did not want to be remembered," he said. "I just wanted the next person who sat at that podium to not have to beg." Nari said nothing. They stood together by the window, watching the young star burn. And behind them, the sound of voices, human and alien, filled the room with the ordinary noise of people who were, for the first time, building something together.